My husband thinks my financial betrayal is having my own investment account. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd need a secret investment account. My name is Sarah, I'm 34 years old, and I've been married to Mark for 8 years. We met in college, fell in love over late-night study sessions and cheap pizza, and built what I thought was a partnership based on trust and mutual respect. Mark works in tech sales, I'm a nurse at Children's Hospital, and together we make a comfortable living. We'd always kept our finances relatively merged, a joint savings account for our future, separate checking accounts for personal expenses, and what I believed was complete transparency about our financial goals. We talked about buying a bigger house someday, maybe starting a family, taking that trip to Italy we'd been dreaming about since our honeymoon. Everything seemed normal until 18 months ago, when I discovered something that shattered my trust completely. It started with small things I didn't think much about at first. Mark became increasingly secretive about his phone, angling it away when I walked by, taking calls in the garage or outside. He'd always been into cryptocurrency and digital investments, something I didn't fully understand, but respected as his hobby. He'd made a few $1,000s on Bitcoin years ago, and considered himself savvy with these things. I trusted him. That was my mistake. The real wake-up call came on a Tuesday evening last year, when I was reviewing our joint savings account online, planning to transfer money for our annual insurance premium. The balance showed $12,000. I stared at the screen, refreshing it 3 times, convinced there was an error. Just 6 months earlier, we'd had $59,000 saved. Years of careful planning, my nursing overtime shifts, his quarterly bonuses, all gone except for that pathetic remaining balance. My hands shook as I scrolled through the transaction history. Withdrawal after withdrawal, all authorized by Mark, all going to some platform I'd never heard of called CryptoApe Exchange. $47,000 transferred out over a 4-month period. I felt physically sick. I waited until Mark got home, the laptop open on the kitchen table, the bank statement glowing like an accusation. When I asked him about it, he actually tried to deflect at first, asking why I was checking the account, whether I didn't trust him. The irony was almost laughable. When I refused to let it go, he finally admitted what he'd done. He'd invested our savings in NFTs, specifically digital images of cartoon monkeys wearing various accessories, convinced they were going to make us millionaires. He'd bought 17 of them at prices ranging from $1,000 to $5,000 each, then kept buying more, as the prices fluctuated, certain the market would rebound. The worst part wasn't even the money, though that was devastating. It was his attitude about the whole thing. Mark genuinely believed he'd made a smart investment decision, and seemed annoyed that I was upset. He kept saying things like everyone in his online investment group was doing it, that I didn't understand the technology, that these assets would eventually be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. He showed me the digital monkeys on his laptop, these cartoon apes, with different colored fur and accessories, and talked about their rarity and future value, as if he were discussing real estate or stock portfolios. Meanwhile, in the same month he'd spent $5,000 on a single pixelated monkey image. He'd complained that I was being financially irresponsible for buying coffee at Starbucks 3 times a week. He'd actually calculated that my coffee habit cost us about $60 a month, and suggested I make coffee at home, to be more responsible with our money. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. I suggested we see a financial advisor together, maybe even a marriage counselor, to work through this breach of trust. Mark refused both, insisting there was nothing wrong with what he'd done, and that I was overreacting. He promised he wouldn't make any more large purchases without discussing them with me first. But I noticed he never actually apologized or acknowledged that spending our entire savings, without my knowledge or consent, was wrong. He seemed to view my anger as a temporary emotional response, rather than a legitimate reaction to a massive betrayal. That's when I realized something fundamental had broken in our marriage, and I needed to protect myself financially. I couldn't control what Mark did with his own money, but I could control my own financial security. So I made a decision that would apparently become the source of our next major conflict. I opened my own investment account with Charles Schwab. I used money from my personal checking account that I'd saved from working extra shifts at the hospital, money that was entirely mine. I started small, depositing $500 initially, then adding to it whenever I could. I educated myself about index funds and diversified investments, the kind of boring, stable strategies that actually build wealth over time, rather than gambling on internet memes. I worked every overtime shift I could pick up, sometimes pulling double shifts on weekends, and funneled that money into my account. It wasn't about hiding money from Mark, or planning to leave him. Though our marriage had certainly been strained since the NFT disaster, it was about ensuring that I had some financial security, independent of someone who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with our combined savings. Over 2 years, I managed to save $15,000. It wasn't the $47,000 that had vanished into digital monkeys, but it was mine, earned through my own labor, and invested responsibly. I wasn't secretive about the account's existence in principle. I just didn't announce it. Mark never asked if I had other accounts, and after his NFT betrayal, I honestly didn't feel I owed him detailed reports on what I did with my personal earnings. The joint savings account remained, though I was far more cautious about how much I contributed to it now. I paid my share of household expenses from my checking account. We split mortgage payments and utilities, and what was left over was my business. At least, that's how I saw it. Mark apparently had different ideas, which I discovered 2 weeks ago in the most dramatic fashion possible. The Charles Schwab statement arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. I usually received electronic statements, but I'd requested a paper copy, because I was considering adjusting my investment allocation, and wanted to review everything carefully. Mark got home before I did, and found the envelope on the kitchen table where I'd left it that morning. When I walked through the door after a 12-hour shift, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening, I was greeted by my husband standing in the kitchen, my investment statement in his hand, his face red with anger. He started yelling immediately, asking how long I'd been hiding money from him, whether I was planning to divorce him, why I'd betrayed his trust. The accusations came so fast I couldn't process them at first. When I finally got him to calm down enough to have a conversation, his position became clear and frankly absurd. Mark believed that by opening an investment account without explicitly telling him, I had committed a financial betrayal equivalent to, or worse than his NFT disaster. He demanded full access to my Charles Schwab account, insisting that married couples shouldn't have financial secrets, and that my separate account was evidence I was planning to leave him. When I refused, pointing out the obvious hypocrisy given that he'd spent $47,000 of our joint money without my knowledge or consent, he claimed it was different. His investment had been made with our money for our future, whereas my account was selfish and secretive. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man who'd gambled away our entire savings on cartoon monkey pictures was lecturing me about financial responsibility and marital transparency because I'd saved my own money in my own account. Update 1: The argument that started when Mark found my Charles Schwab statement lasted 3 days. It wasn't one continuous fight, but rather a series of intense confrontations, interspersed with cold silence. Mark oscillated between anger and hurt, sometimes yelling about my betrayal, other times playing the wounded spouse who couldn't believe his wife didn't trust him. He brought up the account constantly, demanding explanations for every deposit, questioning where the money had come from, insinuating that I must have been planning our divorce for years, to have saved $15,000. When I tried to point out that $15,000 over 2 years wasn't exactly a suspicious amount, considering my overtime work, he dismissed it. He wanted access to the account statements, the login credentials, everything. He talked about marriage being a partnership, about transparency and trust, weaponizing the very concepts he'd violated when he spent our savings without telling me. What bothered me most was his complete inability to see the parallel situation. When I brought up the NFTs again, trying to make him understand why I'd felt the need for financial independence after his betrayal, he actually said it wasn't the same thing at all. According to Mark, he'd made an investment decision that didn't pan out, but it had been made with good intentions for our collective future. My separate account, in his view, was fundamentally different, because it was hidden and selfish. The mental gymnastics were impressive. He'd spent $47,000 without asking me, on an investment so risky and speculative that it might as well have been a casino. But somehow, I was the villain for saving $15,000 of my own earnings in a responsible index fund. I felt like I was losing my mind trying to reason with him. Things escalated when Mark announced he wanted us to see a financial advisor together, someone who could help us rebuild trust and manage our money properly as a couple. This was rich coming from the man who'd refused to see an advisor or counselor after the NFT incident, but I agreed, hoping a neutral third party might help him understand how unreasonable he was being. We met with a certified financial planner named Robert Chen. The following week, Mark had apparently prepared for this meeting like it was a court case, bringing printed statements from our joint account, a list of my Starbucks purchases that he'd somehow tracked over the past year, and a proposal for how we should merge all of our accounts going forward, including my Charles Schwab investment account. I'd brought nothing but my frustration and growing resentment. Robert Chen listened patiently as Mark presented his case, explaining that his wife had hidden an investment account from him and saved money secretly, while their joint savings needed rebuilding after an unsuccessful investment. I noticed Mark conveniently omitted the details about the unsuccessful investment being Monkey NFTs, or that it had been made entirely without my knowledge. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out the full story. The $47,000 lost to digital cartoon apes, Mark's dismissal of my concerns, his refusal to seek counseling, and my subsequent decision to ensure I had some financial independence. I watched Robert's expression shift from neutral professional interest to barely concealed surprise as the details emerged. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, before asking Mark directly whether he'd consulted me before investing their joint savings in NFTs. Mark stumbled through an explanation about how it had been a timing-sensitive opportunity, and he'd planned to tell me once the investment paid off. Robert's advice was diplomatic, but clear. He acknowledged that in an ideal marriage, both partners would be transparent about all finances, but he also emphasized that trust is built through consistent responsible behavior, and that rebuilding trust after a major financial breach takes time and demonstrated change. He looked directly at Mark when he said that last part. He suggested that given the history, it was reasonable for me to maintain some financial independence until trust was fully restored, and that demanding access to my personal account was counterproductive to rebuilding that trust. He recommended marriage counseling focused on financial issues and communication, separate accounts with clearly defined contributions to joint expenses, and a written agreement about any expenditures over a certain threshold from joint funds. Mark listened to all of this with a hardening expression, and I could tell he wasn't hearing what he'd hoped to hear. The drive home was silent. That evening, Mark retreated to his home office and barely spoke to me for the rest of the week. I thought maybe he was processing what the financial advisor had said, perhaps finally recognizing his own role in our current situation. I was wrong. What he was actually doing was researching marriage finances, and apparently, finding online forums that validated his perspective. A week after our meeting with Robert Chen, Mark announced that he'd consulted with a lawyer friend about marital assets and financial disclosure. He informed me that in our state, assets acquired during marriage are generally considered marital property, and that by hiding my investment account, I might be in violation of our marital fiduciary duty to each other. The legal terminology was clearly meant to intimidate me, and honestly, it worked a little. I'm a nurse, not a lawyer, and the idea that I might have done something legally wrong by saving my own money was frightening. Update 2, I decided I needed my own legal advice, not from a friend, but from an actual attorney specializing in family law. I took a day off work and met with a lawyer named Patricia Morrison, whose office was decorated with diplomas and certificates that I found reassuring. I explained the entire situation from beginning to end: the NFT loss, my separate account, Mark's demands, and his recent legal threats. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes. And when I finished, she asked me several specific questions about the source of funds in my investment account, whether Mark and I had a prenuptial agreement, and whether there were any other undisclosed assets on either side. I answered everything honestly. No prenup. My account was funded entirely from my personal earnings, and as far as I knew, Mark had no other hidden accounts, though given recent revelations, I wouldn't be shocked to discover otherwise. Patricia's assessment was both reassuring and sobering. She explained that while assets acquired during marriage are generally considered marital property in our state, the money in my investment account would likely be viewed as separate property since it came from my personal earnings and was maintained separately. More importantly, she emphasized that the existence of the account wasn't any kind of legal violation or betrayal of fiduciary duty, a term she said Mark or his friend was probably misusing. Spouses aren't required to disclose every financial account to each other as a legal matter, though transparency is obviously healthier for a marriage. She pointed out that if anything, Mark's unilateral decision to drain the joint savings account without my knowledge or consent was more problematic, from a legal standpoint, than my separate investment account. However, she also said something that hit me hard. She asked me directly whether I was planning to divorce Mark. Because the steps I'd taken, creating financial independence, and now consulting with a family law attorney, were exactly what she typically advised clients who were preparing to leave their marriages. I sat with that question for a long time. Was I planning to divorce Mark? I honestly didn't know. 2 years ago, before the NFT disaster, I would have said our marriage was solid, not perfect, but good, built on love and partnership. Now I wasn't sure what we had. Trust was gone, at least my trust in him. He'd proven he would make massive financial decisions without consulting me, then minimize my feelings about it. He'd shown himself to be a hypocrite, criticizing my small personal expenses while gambling away our future. And now he was trying to intimidate me with legal threats, rather than acknowledging his own wrongdoing and working to rebuild what he'd broken. When I looked at our marriage honestly, I saw a relationship where I felt I needed to protect myself from my own husband. That realization was devastating. Patricia gave me practical advice, regardless of my long-term plans. She suggested I document everything, keep records of all accounts and transactions, save any texts or emails where Mark discussed the NFTs, or made demands about my investment account, and consider opening a separate checking account that Mark didn't know about if I decided to leave. She also strongly recommended marriage counseling as a last effort to salvage the relationship, if that's what I wanted, but she was clear-eyed about the challenges we faced. Marriages can survive financial infidelity, she said, but only if the person who betrayed the trust takes full responsibility, makes genuine changes, and commits to rebuilding transparency. Mark had done none of those things. Instead, he'd deflected, minimized, and now tried to turn the situation around to make me the villain. Patricia's final comment stuck with me. She said that sometimes people show you who they are through their actions, especially under stress, and the wisest thing you can do is believe them. I went home that evening feeling emotionally exhausted, but also strangely I found Mark in the living room, scrolling through his phone, probably browsing his NFT collection that was now worth a fraction of what he'd paid. I sat down and told him we needed to have a serious conversation about our marriage. I laid out everything I was feeling, the betrayal from the NFTs, my hurt that he'd never truly apologized or taken responsibility, my frustration with his hypocritical demands regarding my investment account, and my growing fear that our marriage might not be salvageable. I told him I'd consulted with an attorney. Not because I'd decided to divorce him, but because I needed to understand my rights given his legal threats. I said that if he wanted to save our marriage, we needed to start marriage counseling immediately. He needed to acknowledge what he'd done wrong without deflection or excuses, and he needed to stop demanding access to my personal account. I was as honest and direct as I've ever been in our relationship. Mark's response told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. He listened to my whole speech with an expression that grew increasingly cold. And when I finished, he said that I was being dramatic and unfair. He reiterated that his NFT investment had been a reasonable risk that simply didn't pay off, something that happens in any investment, and that I was holding a grudge over what was essentially bad luck. He said that my separate account was fundamentally different, a deliberate deception that proved I didn't trust him and was probably planning to leave. He accused me of consulting a divorce attorney to threaten him, claimed I was trying to manipulate him with tears and emotional appeals, and said that if anyone should be hurt and angry, it was him. I'd hidden money, consulted with lawyers behind his back, and refused to work toward real transparency in our marriage. He agreed to marriage counseling, but only if I agreed to merge my investment account back into our joint finances first, as a show of good faith and commitment to our partnership. I felt something break inside me during that conversation. Not dramatically, not with anger or tears, but with a quiet finality. I realized I was arguing with someone who would never admit he was wrong, who would always find a way to make himself the victim, who valued being right more than he valued our relationship. The man I'd married 8 years ago, or at least the man I'd thought I married, wouldn't have gambled away our savings on cartoon monkeys. He wouldn't have blamed me for his poor decisions. He wouldn't have tried to control my personal earnings while refusing to take responsibility for his own financial recklessness. Maybe that man had never really existed. Or maybe Mark had changed over the years, but either way, I couldn't stay married to the person sitting across from me now. I told him I would agree to marriage counseling, but I wouldn't be merging my accounts as a prerequisite, and if he couldn't accept that, then perhaps we needed to have a different conversation about the future of our marriage. Update 3: We started marriage counseling 3 weeks ago with a therapist named Dr. Ellen Bradford, who specializes in financial issues within relationships. Mark agreed to attend, though I could tell he viewed it as something he was doing to placate me rather than because he thought we actually needed it. The first session was dedicated to establishing ground rules and hearing both of our perspectives on what had brought us to counseling. Dr. Bradford was skilled at creating a space where we both felt heard, asking probing questions without seeming judgmental. Mark presented his version of events, emphasizing my secret account and what he characterized as my refusal to work as a financial team. I presented mine, including the full context of the NFT situation and Mark's subsequent behavior. Dr. Bradford listened carefully, took notes, and at the end of the session, she gave us homework. We were each supposed to write a letter to the other, explaining our feelings and needs without blame or accusations. Focusing on I statements and emotional honesty. I took the homework seriously, spending several evenings drafting and redrafting my letter to Mark. I wrote about feeling betrayed when I discovered the missing savings, scared about our financial future, hurt by his dismissiveness of my concerns, and ultimately lost about whether we could rebuild trust. I wrote about wanting a partnership where we made major decisions together, where neither of us had to hide or protect ourselves from the other, where financial responsibility was mutual. I wrote about still loving the man I'd married, but feeling increasingly disconnected from the man he'd become. It was honest and vulnerable in a way I hadn't been able to be in our face-to-face arguments. Mark's letter to me was significantly shorter, and felt more like a list of grievances than emotional honesty. He wrote about feeling disrespected by my secret account, frustrated that I wouldn't move past the NFT situation, and concerned that I was being influenced by outside people like lawyers and financial advisors who didn't understand our relationship. There was no acknowledgement of his own role in our problems, no vulnerability, no real emotional opening. Our second counseling session focused on those letters. Dr. Bradford had us read them aloud to each other, which was uncomfortable, but illuminating. As Mark read his letter, I watched Dr. Bradford's face remain professionally neutral, but I noticed how she wrote several notes during his reading. When it was my turn, I could barely get through some sections without my voice breaking. After we both finished, Dr. Bradford asked Mark directly whether he could understand why I might have felt I needed financial independence after discovering he'd spent their savings without consultation. Mark's answer was telling. He said he understood why I was upset, but that creating a secret account wasn't the right solution. And that if I'd had concerns, I should have communicated them more clearly rather than taking unilateral action. Dr. Bradford pressed him on this, pointing out that I had communicated my concerns repeatedly, and his response had been dismissive, and that my account wasn't created until after his spending, making it a reaction, rather than an initial betrayal. Mark became defensive, saying it felt like Dr. Bradford was taking my side. That session ended tensely, with Dr. Bradford assigning us new homework. Time alone to think about what we truly wanted from our marriage, and whether we were both willing to do the work to rebuild trust. She was diplomatic, but I sensed she had concerns about whether Mark was capable of the self-reflection necessary for real change. Over the next week, Mark seemed to soften slightly. He actually apologized, for how he'd handled the NFT situation, and acknowledged that spending the money without talking to me first had been wrong. It felt like progress. He said he wanted to rebuild trust and work toward a real partnership. I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe counseling was working, that maybe we could find our way back to each other. That hope was extinguished pretty quickly when I realized what Mark's version of rebuilding trust looked like. He presented me with what he called a financial partnership agreement that he'd drafted himself. It outlined how we would handle money going forward. Shared access to all accounts, monthly budget meetings, no expenditures over $500 without mutual agreement, and full financial transparency, including passwords to all banking and investment accounts. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, the kind of thing a financial advisor might recommend for a couple rebuilding after a breach of trust. But as I read through it more carefully, I noticed several problems. First, the agreement would require me to transfer my Charles Schwab account into a joint account with Mark having equal access. Second, it stipulated that any future income would be deposited into joint accounts with only a small personal allowance for each of us. Third, and most problematically, it included a provision that past financial decisions, specifically mentioning the NFT investment, would be considered closed matters, not subject to ongoing discussion or blame. Essentially, Mark wanted me to give him access to my money, and agree never to bring up his catastrophic financial betrayal again. all in the name of moving forward as partners. I told Mark I needed time to think about his proposal, and showed it to Patricia Morrison, my attorney. She read through it carefully, and pointed out that while some provisions were reasonable, others were concerning, particularly the requirement that I transfer my separate property into joint ownership and the clause preventing discussion of past issues. She advised me to propose modifications if I wanted to continue trying to save the marriage, or to recognize this as a sign that Mark's idea of partnership was really about control. I tried the modifications route. I told Mark I was willing to commit to financial transparency going forward, including shared access to account statements and mutual decision-making on large expenditures, but that I wasn't comfortable transferring my investment account to joint ownership immediately. I suggested that could be something we work toward as trust was rebuilt over time, and that the clause about not discussing past issues needed to be removed because you can't heal from something by pretending it didn't happen. Mark's reaction was explosive. He accused me of not being committed to our marriage. Said I was holding the past over his head instead of forgiving and moving forward, and claimed that my refusal to merge our finances proved I was planning to leave him. We had our worst fight in years, the kind where voices are raised and things are said that can't be taken back. He called me controlling and vindictive. I called him manipulative and financially reckless. He said if I couldn't trust him with my money, we had no marriage. I said if he couldn't take responsibility for his actions, he was right. We ended up sleeping in separate rooms that night, and the next morning, Mark told me he thought we should separate for a while so we could both get perspective on what we wanted. I agreed, feeling both relieved and devastated. Update for Mark moved into his brother's house 2 weeks ago. We're calling it a trial separation. Not officially separated or filing for anything, just taking space to figure out our next steps. The house feels different without him, quieter, but also somehow more peaceful. I don't have to worry about monitoring what I say, or defending my financial decisions. I can just exist without constantly being on guard. My friends have been incredibly supportive, especially my coworker, Jennifer, who went through a divorce 5 years ago. She's been helping me process everything without pushing me toward any particular decision. What's been most helpful is her validation that I'm not crazy for feeling betrayed by the NFT situation, or for wanting to maintain some financial independence. Sometimes when you're in the middle of a situation, especially when your partner is telling you you're wrong, you start to doubt your own perception of reality. I've continued with therapy, though now I'm seeing Dr. Bradford individually rather than for couples counseling. Mark stopped going after our second joint session, saying it wasn't helpful, and the therapist was biased against him. Dr. Bradford has been helping me work through my feelings about the marriage, and figure out what I actually want rather than what I think I should want. She's helped me see some patterns in my relationship with Mark that I'd missed, ways he'd been controlling, or dismissive that I'd normalized over time. The NFT situation wasn't an isolated incident, but rather an extreme example of behavior that had been present in smaller ways throughout our marriage. Mark had always been the one who made the big decisions, who controlled the narrative, who managed to make his mistakes seem less serious than mine. I'd adapted to that dynamic without realizing it, making myself smaller to avoid conflict, accepting his version of events, even when it didn't match my experience. One of the hardest realizations has been that I don't miss Mark as much as I thought I would. I miss the idea of him, the partner I thought I had, the marriage I believed we were building, but the actual man who moved out 2 weeks ago. I don't miss his defensiveness, his inability to apologize sincerely, his constant need to be right, his financial recklessness masked as savvy investing. I don't miss walking on eggshells around topics he didn't want to discuss. I don't miss feeling like I had to protect myself from my own husband. What I do miss is the companionship, having someone to share meals with and discuss my day with, the comfortable routine of a long-term partnership. But I'm starting to understand that companionship without trust, respect, and genuine partnership isn't really companionship at all. It's just cohabitation with someone who happens to share your last name. Mark reached out yesterday asking if we could meet for coffee to talk about next steps. I agreed, curious about what he wants to say, and whether the time apart has given him any clarity, or prompted any real part of me hopes he'll show up with genuine understanding of how his actions contributed to where we are, ready to take real responsibility, and do the work necessary to rebuild. But a larger, more realistic part of me expects more of the same. Deflection and demands, and an inability to see beyond his own perspective. I've been preparing myself emotionally for that likelihood. Working with Dr. Bradford on staying centered in my own truth, regardless of what Mark says, or how he tries to reframe the situation. I've also been thinking practically about what divorce would actually look like if we go that direction. Patricia Morrison walked me through the basics: division of assets, including the house, spousal support considerations, the legal process timeline. It's daunting, but not as frightening as it once seemed. I have my investment account. I have stable income. I have skills that are in demand as a nurse. I can take care of myself financially, which was the whole point of maintaining that separate account in the first place. What felt like a betrayal to Mark, that $15,000 investment account, might end up being the foundation of my financial security and independence as a single woman. There's something poetic about that, though I'm sure Mark wouldn't see it that way. I meet Mark for coffee tomorrow afternoon. I don't know what he's going to say, or what decision we'll ultimately make about our marriage. Maybe he's had real insights during our separation, and is ready to do the work of rebuilding trust, taking responsibility, and becoming the partner I need. Maybe he's still convinced I'm the problem, and wants to issue more ultimatums about merging finances and moving on from the past without addressing it. Maybe we're simply too different in how we view money, responsibility, and partnership to make this work. What I do know is that I'm not willing to sacrifice my financial security or my sense of reality to maintain a marriage that requires me to be someone I'm not. If that makes me the villain in Mark's story, the wife who betrayed him by saving her own money after he gambled away their future on monkey NFTs, then so be it. I'd rather be the villain in someone else's narrative than lose myself trying to be the hero in a story that was never really about partnership at all. The Charles Schwab statement that started this whole fight is still on my kitchen table, though now it's just paper rather than evidence of betrayal. That account represents more than $15,000 in diversified index funds. It represents my autonomy, my ability to protect myself, my refusal to be financially dependent on someone who proved he couldn't be trusted with our collective resources. Whatever happens with Mark, whether we find a way to rebuild, or ultimately decide to divorce, I'll keep that account. Not because I'm hiding money, or planning betrayal, but because I've learned an expensive lesson about the importance of financial independence. Marriage should be a partnership built on trust, but trust has to be earned and maintained through consistent, responsible behavior. Mark spent $47,000 on cartoon monkeys without telling me, then spent 2 years blaming me for not getting over it fast enough. That's not partnership. That's not trust. That's not a foundation for a future together. And recognizing that isn't betrayal. It's clarity.